Thank you. We now come to the third motion, number 3, on social security, and I call Minister Paul Maynard to move.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And with your permission, I beg to move that the draft Social Security Benefits Operating Order 2024 be approved. This draft order will increase relevant state pension rates by 8.5%, in line with the growth in average earnings in the year to May-July 2023. It will increase most other benefit rates by 6.7%, in line with the rise in the CPI index in the year to September 2023. Subject to Parliamentary approval, these changes will take effect from the 8th of April and will apply for the tax year 2024-2025.
Order. Could I just ask those who are not participating in the debate, because it's a bit difficult to hear the Minister. Thank you. Minister. I was just trying to get everyone to be quiet so we could hear you.
The government's commitment...
I've just been asked to clarify that you are moving motion number 3 on social security.
That is the one I'm talking about, yes.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you.
Which, for the information of the House, covers state pensions. The fourth one covers the guaranteed minimum pension, which is a sub-element of the pensions issue. So, as I will explain the different elements that this...
Linden.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I clarify that we are taking motions 3 on social security and motions 4 together in one block as one debate, or are we scrutinising both orders separately? So one debate first on social security to be followed by debate on pensions. I think it would be helpful for the clarity to the House exactly what's happening.
We have motion number 3 on social security, which we will debate, and then we have motion number 4 on pensions. 2 debates, 2 separate debates. Is that clear? Thank you. Minister.
And indeed, those are the questions I was asking a few days ago as to whether they're taken separately or together. They are taken separately. The government's commitment to the triple lock means that I will indeed.
Giving way, and I'm very relieved that we are getting a proper uprating this year. But the headline rate of benefits currently is the lowest it's been in real terms for 40 years. Why is it that ministers currently have set benefits at a level so much lower in real terms than was chosen by Margaret Thatcher, Peter Lilly, John Major, Norman Fowler? Why is it so much lower?
I didn't realise there's always a line of contained debate about the adequacy of the overall benefit system. I think it was a debate that Beveridge was having back under the Labour government in 1945 as to how to understand the concept of adequacy within the benefit system. So I think what we're doing today is making sure that the purchasing power of benefits is maintained, that we're adhering to the triple lock, as intervention allows me to restate for I think now the 5th time the government's commitment to the triple lock, meaning that the basic and state pension will be uprated by the highest of the gross in earnings or prices, or 2.5%. This year that will mean an 8.5% rise for 2024-2025, taking the basic state pension from £156.20 to £169.50 a week, and the full rate of the new state pension from £203.65 to £221.20 a week. Additional state pensions, such as the state earnings-related pension schemes and protected payments in the new state pension, will rise by 6.7%. The government is committed to supporting pensioners on the lowest incomes, and accordingly the safety net provided by the Pension Credit Standard Minimum Guarantee will increase by 8.5%. So for single pensioners it will increase from £201.05 to £218.15, and for couples it will increase from £306.85 to £332.95 a week. Madam Deputy Speaker, when it comes to support for those in the labour market, such as universal credit, and the means-tested benefits it replaces, there is always a need to take into account work incentives, as well as financial support for those in low-paid work who are looking for work or who are unable to work. The government announced a range of employment and conditionality measures at the autumn statement to maintain and improve work incentives. It is also right, however, in striking a balance to increase the rate of these benefits by 6.7% in line with the increase in CPI in the year to September 2023. A 6.7% increase means that universal credit will retain its purchasing power in the broader context of the Prime Minister's delivered commitment to halving the rate of inflation. Government remains mindful of work incentives in the benefit system, and accordingly this order also increases the universal credit work allowance by 6.7%. They will increase from £379 to £404 a month for those also receiving support for housing costs, and from £631 to £673 a month for those not receiving support for housing costs. This 6.7% increase will also apply to the rates of contributory job seekers allowance, contributory employment and support allowance, additional needs disability benefits such as personal independence payment, carers allowance, and statutory payments such as statutory maternity pay, statutory paternity pay, and statutory sick pay. Madam Deputy Speaker, the draft order, if Parliament approves it, commits the Government to increase expenditure of £19 billion in 2024-25. We believe it is right to make such a commitment because it maintains the triple lock, which benefits both pensioners who are already in receipt of the basic and new state pensions, and younger people who are building up future entitlements as a foundation for private saving. It raises the level of the safety net in pension credit beyond the increase in prices. It is part of a package of support for those in the labour market, which protects the value of benefits at a time of high, if falling, inflation, whilst maintaining and increasing work incentives. It also maintains the purchasing power of benefits to help with additional costs arising from disability. And it provides protection against inflation for people who are currently unable to participate in the labour market, such as full-time carers, who provide such an essential service to those that they care for. On that basis, I commend this order to the House.
The question is motion number 3 as on the order paper. Shadow Minister Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Minister for just clarifying there the way in which we are taking these orders today. I want to speak about the social security uprating because whilst we welcome the uprating today, we want to see social security keep pace with prices, particularly at a time of spiking inflation and economic instability. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's worth pointing out that before 2010, uprating in the manner in which we're doing today was the norm for both Labour and Conservative governments. But the past decade and a half has seen a change, and there has been a variable approach to uprating from this government. In fact, the debate about uprating has become almost farcical, with year by year there becoming speculation coming from, I presume, some part of government, Madam Deputy Speaker, some speculation that the uprating, which had been absolutely standard year in, year out under previous governments, that this may or may not happen. And this speculation isn't coming out of thin air. It causes immense amounts of distress and worry for people, and it's almost as though there now has to be a campaign for the status quo normal, which I don't think is acceptable, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I wonder why we are in what seems like a policy roundabout, where every time we go through having this debate about the uprating, only for the government to then do it. And I think that that is a problematic way to do something which is a normal function of social security, the idea that it ought to keep pace with the cost of living. I also think, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have to be honest about the reality and the situation that we face right now, because we have had universal credit for a decade or more, and I have been in this House long enough to have heard promise after promise that universal credit would radically improve the work incentives that people had, that people's position in life would be made much better by the universal credit reforms. And Whilst I think that DWP has many talented civil servants within it, they've been working hard to try and make the customer service elements, I'm sure, function better. We have to look at the reality that we face. 400,000, Madam Deputy Speaker, more children in poverty than when Labour left office in 2010. That is not acceptable to me. Most people in poverty today are in work. So the idea that we hear again and again and again in this chamber that the best route out of poverty is work is simply not the case. 2/3 of children in poverty live in a house where someone goes out to work, and I would like the government to recognise that fact. We've had a decade and a half of so-called reform, and all we've done is got back to the situation where we have children growing up dealing with the stress of not having enough money in the family home to give them a proper childhood. And I don't think that is acceptable. We can see the consequences of a decade and a half of Tory rule all around us, whether it is the food bank parcels in the school office, the nurses who do a 12-hour shift but can't make ends meet, or in the worst case, Madam Deputy Speaker, the man curled up in a sleeping bag in Westminster Tube Station as we leave this house. We can see the consequences of Conservative government all around us. But Labour has a plan, Madam Deputy Speaker. When it comes to getting people a better life, able to make ends meet and a good start for their children, we will make sure there's a breakfast club in every primary school. We will help people have access to cheaper energy and an insulated home so that the spiking costs people have faced in recent years are dealt with. We will reform universal credit, job centres and employment support to make sure people get a better job with better pay, which will help them live their life properly and save money for the Treasury. And we will have a child poverty strategy that will overhaul universal credit. And with regards to social security, I simply say this, Madam Deputy Speaker, in finishing. We need an end to this roundabout over uprating. We're simply asking that we have consistency of approach so that, as in previous decades under governments of all kinds, we have the proper uprating of social security without the constant speculation coming from wherever it is in the Conservative government that somehow ordinary working people must pay the price for their economic chaos. That's not fair. Let's end the chaos and have the proper normal uprating in the usual way.
Nigel Mills.
I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to welcome the rises in the state benefits and the state pension. I think it would have been unthinkable not to have raised benefits by inflation, and equally unthinkable not to have increased the state pension by the triple lock. So the government have done the right things. These decisions are the right ones, and I'll happily support them in the unlikely event we get a division later. But I would agree with the Shadow Minister, actually, that this is not the most exciting piece of parliamentary theatre, even though we're spending tens of billions on this. The House is empty, these things go through on the nod, we can't amend them, and the whole process creates a load of uncertainty for people who have to live on these benefits. So I would actually agree, if we're going to find the money, quite rightly, to put these benefits up by the two highest amounts I think I can remember in my 14 years, and probably going back a lot longer, in what scenario now are we not going to increase benefits and the state pension by CPI or the triple lock? And if that is the position, let's just change the process and have a default increase by a CPI and the triple lock, so we don't have to go through all this uncertainty. And if any future government ever wanted to do something different, they could just bring a bill in, as George Osborne did in the early years of the coalition, to do something different. Anyway, it wouldn't preclude that. It would require the House to give their assent to that change, but it would mean we wouldn't have to go through the uncertainty and the annual campaign to get to where we all think we're going to get to anyway, which I don't think helps anybody. And it would spare the Minister the excitement of this afternoon and the confusion of what's in which of these orders, which he might appreciate. But we'll leave that one for the Minister to see whether he's remotely tempted by that. So for this crazy process we've come to the right answer, but I still don't really believe that we're in a sensible position where we have to use September's inflation for an April increase in benefits, and we have to have an uprating order quite a while after the Chancellor's announced this in the budget. Now, the Select Committee did recommend we bring these orders earlier than February, so I commend the government. We are doing it in January. I suppose that is positive sense of progress. I don't quite know why we couldn't have done this in November to get the certainty there. But I would hope as these years go by, one year we'll get some good news. The Minister will say, actually, we've now got so many people on universal credit that we know we can uprate far more quickly, that actually we can use a much later inflation number because the amount of manual processing we have to do for the old benefits is much less of a work demand than it used to be. So we can actually move to use December's inflation, so we can get the benefit increase to be much nearer the actual cost of living and not have the horrible situation we have been having where we're effectively 6 months behind and there's been a huge spike in the meantime that people can't afford to pay the bills. So perhaps the Minister could update the House on whether we are any nearer that prospect of having a slightly more sensible process where we're not using out-of-date information and we have to give people a rise that's already 6 months ago, which exposes a load of risk in that situation. And the other question I have is there was a lot of noise around the triple lock being unsustainable and we're going to have to get rid of it. We can't afford to give pensioners this level of increase. And yet I can't think of any justification why we could ever give people living reliant on a state pension who have no possibility of going back to work less than inflation. It would just be an intolerable situation to put people in. And I think we've established over many long and painful years that giving pensioners less than earnings actually isn't a very attractive position. We had that for a while, and the coalition government quite rightly reversed it. It's one of the first things we did when we came to power 14 years ago. So I think it's utterly impossible, the idea that anybody is going to take away the link to inflation or earnings. I don't know why we have to have speculation about that. I suppose we all wish that the 2.5% was a relevant consideration for us, but it looks like it might be a few years before we have to worry about that part of the triple lock kicking in. But was the problem that the rise in earnings and the rise of inflation have got out of step and have got into two different financial years, and therefore effectively we're giving that increase twice because we give it on inflation in year one, and then when pay rises catch up in year two we end up giving it again, and we've accidentally given a much higher amount over a period than either inflation or earnings. And if that is the thing that risks the long-term future of the triple lock, does the Minister think that a rolling 2-year or 3-year average would fix that? Because if that's the price of making triple lock safe for the long term, I would pay it. I wouldn't choose it. But if that stops this uncertainty about this whole thing being affordable, it would be better. So just with those remarks, perhaps the Minister could help us with a better process for future years. But with that, I fully support these orders, and I'll happily vote for them in the unlikely event that we get to a vote.
SNP spokesperson David Linden.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And it's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend and fellow member of the Select Committee. I stand here with a somewhat renewed sense of frustration following the release of GRF's UK Poverty 2024 report, which I will refer back to throughout the course of my contribution today. But I find myself again stood here in this Parliament against the backdrop of a truly dire situation, one characterised by destitution. And I wonder what more can be said or done to make the British Government realise the true extent of the hardship that it's inflicted upon people across these islands. And whilst the SNP will not oppose the orders for 24-25, to keep it plain and simple, the damage has already been done. No amount of uprating will truly address the long-term consequences of entrenched destitution that has been inflicted upon households as a result of this British Government, who I would argue have been asleep at the wheel now for 14 years. And although the Government's announcement to uprate social security benefits means that shortfalls should not increase any further this year, these orders still fail to undo any of the cumulative impact of years of cuts to social security that households across these islands have endured. And whilst the British Government has been asleep at the wheel, people across the country have been kept awake at night due to the sheer amount of stress and anxiety, wondering how they'll feed themselves, their families, how they will afford or often not afford even the essentials. And we are faced with a horrendous picture, but it is the stark reality of living with this Westminster Government. young children, school children, pensioners, young adults, those in and out of works. No one, Madam Deputy Speaker, is left unscathed when they have the misfortune of interacting with the UK's social security system. And as the Minister comes back to the dispatch box later, I'm sure full of the civil service-inspired lines that don't meet the reality outside Whitehall, we are faced with the cold, hard truth that cannot be escaped. People are suffering and will only continue to suffer for as long as this government refuses to fix the known policy issues, which I'm sure my honourable friend might be able to elaborate on.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Surely we're here debating what is supposed to be an adequate payment for social security, and that is, the government's case is completely weakened, is it not, with this ridiculous system we have of loans and deductions in which his constituents in Glasgow East and in Glasgow South West are on average seeing their universal credit payments being deducted by £60 a month because of this ridiculous system.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I pay tribute to my honourable friend from Glasgow South West, who is an assiduous questioner of the government through WPQs on the issue of debt and deductions. And he's right to cite the figures in Glasgow, well known about local citizens' advice bureaus all over our constituencies. We'll refer to them, but of course we're not the only members of this House whose constituents are impacted by the debt and deductions policy of this government, which is often found wanting. And so if the Minister could touch on debt and deductions as he sums up, that would actually be quite helpful. Now, in a Westminster Hall debate I held just 3 weeks ago about the cost of living crisis, I compared the UK's social security system, one that used to be hailed as a safety net for those who needed it, to something that now resembles nothing more than a frayed rope, unable to bear the weight of the individuals who rely on it and as a lifeline. And after reading the new report and statistics produced by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, I've never been more assured in my assessment of the state of the social security policies enforced by this Westminster government, because the JRF report outlines that more than 1 in 5 people in the UK were in poverty in 2021-22. Madam Deputy Speaker, that is 14.4 million people, 4.2 million of which were children and 2.1 million that were pensioners. And just as the statistics from Save the Children and Age Scotland show, and I'll outline them shortly, the GRF report has to be a wake-up call for this government, and indeed the government that may well follow, if we are to make any tangible change to the broken system that I would argue lies before us. Because even in the GRF report, the graph illustrates the percentage of people in poverty, where it is broken down into, and I quote, in poverty, but not in deep poverty, in deep poverty, but not in very deep poverty, and in very deep poverty. I must be honest, it feels completely surreal that we are at a point where statistical analysis is having to be broken down into these categories in order to illustrate the situation that people are having to endure. And it is utterly shameful that such categories even have to exist in one of the richest countries on this planet. And I understand that members around the chamber today, I may seem frustrated, and that's because I am, but the statistics pulled from this report are not just numbers, they are the very reality of people in communities like Parkhead and Shettleston that I represent, or Moss Park or Cardonald that are represented by my honourable friends. And these represent truly harrowing findings. Now, I want to turn to universal credit, as the Honourable Lady from Wirral South did, because universal credit is failing the very people it is in theory supposed to support. Instead, the policy drives destitution and food bank usage. It has been reported that 68% of people referred to a Trussell Trust food bank in Scotland who are in receipt of universal credit have money automatically deducted from their payments to repay debts like a DWP advance, the very point my honourable friend from Glasgow South West was making. And additionally, food banks in the Trussell Trust network have been distributing around 3 million emergency food parcels across the UK in financial year 22-23, more than 1 million of which were for children. And whilst this government refuses to scrap abhorrent policies like the 2-child cap and associated rape clause, the DWP's own figures show that in April last year alone, 1.5 million children were affected by the two-child limit. And I say that in the context of that million children that were in receipt of food parcels. This, of course, is in addition to data from Save the Children, who found that 60% of households affected by the two-child cap have at least one adult in paid employment. And so often the government, doubtless I imagine that the Minister will stand up and say that the two-child cap is about making sure that people get into work. But the reality is that the two-child cap already impacts people who are in work. Punitive sanctions, deductions, the two-child limit, the 5-week wait, all, Madam Deputy Speaker, defining characteristics that are inherently part of this British government's social security system, policies that have and continue to cause hardship to so many. And although I could stand here today and generate endless amounts of research and statistics for the Minister, my plea is simple, because social security does not have to be done this way. We do not have to continue down this road of sanctions, deductions, rate clauses and 5-week waits. Now, it is an undeniable fact that the Scottish Government cannot make any tangible change to these policies while 85% of welfare expenditure and income-related benefits remain reserved to this Government here in Westminster. And for every step forward that the Scottish Government tries to take, Westminster drags us back too. The Scottish Government desperately need the opportunity to create a system, one designed to actively tackle poverty and empower those who interact with the system without one hand being tied behind their back. And certainly where we've had the power to do so, we've introduced the game-changing policies like the Scottish Child Payment. An analysis shows that the Scottish Child Payment could lift up to 50,000 children out of relative poverty in 23-24. And it's because the Scottish Government chooses to prioritise that. But child poverty rates in Scotland still sit at 24%. That's still far, far too high. It is in comparison to England's at 31% and Wales at 28%. And this is likely to be due at least in part to the Scottish Child Payment. But fundamentally, it is a political choice to lift children out of poverty. And if this Westminster Government is unwilling to make that choice, then I simply ask them to hand over the reins of power to the Scottish Government, who are more than willing and certainly ready to implement a system that would allow people to thrive rather than being punished for their circumstances. And until that happens, the Scottish Government is left fighting an uphill battle against a Westminster social security system that is frankly broken beyond repair. And again, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm left wondering how different things might be if Scotland were able to take all of the legislative and fiscal responsibility for these issues through the normal powers of independence. And whether it's the British Government's cruel sanctions regime or the refusal to fix known policy failures that only pushes people further into hardship, this will sadly be one of the defining legacies of this Tory Government. Because as a result, poverty no longer just exists within our society, it is deepening, it is ingrained, and it is causing insurmountable levels of pain to people right across these islands. And as we are faced with the reality of more food parcels than ever before being delivered through the Trussell Trust networks and shockingly high levels of child poverty, the only conclusion that I can draw is that these are all signs of a government and indeed a union that people in Scotland must escape if we are to have any hope of a fair and prosperous future.
Yeah.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you so much, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, I would start by welcoming the uprating order, including the uprating around the local housing allowance, which I think has been frozen now for over 10 years. So I think that is a significant move forward, shall I put it like that. But I think we need to, as my honourable friend on the front bench was saying earlier, I think we need to recognise the context that that this apparent very positive uprating is being brought in. We need to look at what's happened really since 2010 and the various cuts and freezes to working age support in particular over the last 14 years. So I was just going through some figures, Madam Deputy Speaker, just before the debate started. Between 2010 and 12, the uprating was about 1.5%. Between 2012 and 2016, it was 1% a year. And between 2016 and 2020, it was 0. So this is the context of that, and of course the average annual CPI for each of those years was about 3%. So there's been a steady and consistent erosion in the value of social security, which is what my honourable friend was mentioning. And this affected universal credit, job seekers allowance, employment and support allowance, income support, housing benefit, child tax credits, working tax credits and child benefits. The Resolution Foundation at the time estimated that this was the equivalent of a cut of over £20 billion a year. £20 billion a year taken out of support of working age people. And what is not well understood is that these are predominantly people in low paid income. Yes, there are a small proportion of people on unemployment support and long-term unemployment, but this is a tiny fraction of the population. This is predominantly the support for people in low paid work. I think my honourable friend and member of the Select Committee mentioned about the Joseph Rowntree Foundation Poverty 24 report in his remarks, and I do invite people to read, if you can't read the whole document, read the summary. It is absolutely shocking. So the headlines of it, we are equivalent now in terms of the levels of poverty before the pandemic. And that's relative poverty. I know the government prefers, because it's in their advantage, to talk about absolute poverty. But in terms of relative poverty, we are back to where we were really in relation to before the pandemic. And just for everybody's understanding, what happened during the pandemic, who was affected, where was affected, reflected that poverty, those inequalities. That drove who was going to get ill. It drove what happened during the pandemic, and we're back there, not having learnt very much, I would say. 14.5 million people living in this relative poverty. Of those, 6 million in deep poverty. Now, deep poverty is for people who are living below 40% of median income. And then there's the other category that my honourable friend from the Select Committee mentioned, those in very deep poverty. Another level below that, in even worse poverty. And very deep poverty, the average income of somebody in very deep poverty is 59% what we recognise as the relative poverty level. 59%. How on earth can we in this country think that that is acceptable? We heard last year about the increase in destitution. And destitution, another category altogether, the worst of the worst. Deep poverty, very deep poverty, destitution. And that has increased, that's doubled. 3.8 million people in destitution can't afford to meet their basic physical needs, to stay warm, to stay dry, to stay clean, and to be able to feed themselves. And what has also been said by my honourable friends from the front bench is in terms of the children that this is affecting. The children of these families that this is affecting. We know that for every 1% increase in child poverty, 5.8, and I apologise for the fractions here, 5.8 extra children will not reach their first birthday out of 100,000 live births. This is the consequence of poverty. For those who do survive, it affects every aspect of their development, including how their brains are wired, how they will develop, how they will attain at school. It is a disgrace in this country that we have these levels of poverty. I will.
I find that we have this debate every year and it becomes increasingly distressing. One of the statistics that's the most distressing this year, I think, for me, was the European comparison of growth rates. The height of children in this country is now falling behind the height of children in Europe. What does that mean? That's not just a cosmetic issue, that's an issue with regard to the health of the child and the ability of the child to flourish.
My right honourable friend makes a very important point, and I'm going to come on to that, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker. So we've talked about children, disabled people, another cohort, another group of people who have been really, really punished over the last 14 years. Absolute, again, disgrace. I'm sorry I'm using the same phrases, but I can't think of adequate enough vocabulary that expresses my rage, the fact that this is happening. And ethnic minority communities as well, disproportionately affected by this.
Honourable friend give way.
I will.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend is making a deeply important speech, and does she agree with me? It's also very important to consider the effect of poor quality housing on all the groups that she mentions, and in particular the effect of the combination of poverty and poor quality housing, leading to actions like parents turning heating down.
Very, very good point. And when we think of, in terms of the most, DWP is the biggest cost in terms of government spending in government. State pension is the largest group or factor. And then if we look at universal credit, but third on that is housing benefit and support that is provided through universal credit element for housing. If we're providing, as taxpayers, as a government, providing this money, you would think that in terms of the quality of housing there would be some way that we can safeguard this, given that there is a large investment by the state in this regard. Can I just move on? Again, my honourable friends made important points about the food bank use and how this has escalated. I've made this point before, but in Oldham we didn't have a food bank before 2010. We now have several to meet the need. But something I know that will be of interest to the Minister responding to this debate, because we're very aware of the impact on the labour market, and so on, and that we need to have a healthy labour market to be able to provide the growth that we all want to see across the country. Well, again, all the evidence is that that's not going to happen for the reasons my right honourable friend has said. We are becoming an increasingly unhealthy country. Our healthy life expectancy is declining, and our life expectancy is declining, and it has been since 2017. And the warning that was made by Professor Sir Michael Marmot at that time, and what he said the consequences would be. And of course they have. In the report that he produced at the beginning of this year, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I asked the Prime Minister a question on this last week, if everyone had the good health of the least deprived 10% of the population, there would have been 1 million fewer deaths in England in the period 2012 to 2019. 148,000 can be linked to austerity, directly linked to austerity. And in 2020, the first year of COVID, the COVID pandemic, there was a further 28,000 deaths that could have been prevented. These are the consequences of the inequality, the poverty and inequality that we have in this country. The Select Committee is undertaking an inquiry in terms of the adequacy of social security support with this in mind. And I just want to commend again the JRF, Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Trussell Trust, who have really put together some very interesting recommendations about the Essentials Guarantee, about what we can try and provide that is based on need rather than some quite subjective sort of view of what the level of support should be. And I hope that the Select Committee can support some aspect of that. Can I just mention what the figures are, Madam Deputy Speaker? £120 instead of the per week for a single person, instead of the £70 currently. So it would be a good step in the right direction. Thank you for your lassitude, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thanks again.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, given the number of us in the chamber, I don't think this afternoon is going to be full of high drama, and I, like others, don't intend to cause a division in relation to the debate today. But the Government did make its decision on uprating last year, and pensioners did let out a collective sigh of relief around the country that the triple lock has been kept. And no one is going to vote down either this or the later SI. It's quite clear that some on this side, all of us on this side, want it to go further, but we know that the harm of torpedoing them would be catastrophic because they would prevent the increases that have been proposed. But as the Honourable Member for Amber Valley said, there are different ways of doing this. But given that we do have this opportunity, I'm going to take it to allow the Minister to get a feel for the mood of the House, how we feel the Government is performing in this area, and more importantly, in an election year, how our constituents feel that they are performing. Because it's quite clear that the outcomes of government policy are hard to swallow. What we are seeing is women dying as they fight for compensation in relation to the government's maladministration in relation to their state pensions, and that's clearly not acceptable. We know that pensioners are going hungry and risking illness because they can't afford to either eat or stay warm. That is not acceptable. And again, I raised a number of these issues relating to pensioner poverty in my recent adjournment debate, and I do look forward to meeting the Minister as was promised and discuss a number of those issues with him. And as members have also already raised, we know that 1 in 3 children are living in poverty, and that is not acceptable. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the report card is in, and it is a fail. Record numbers of families are relying on emergency food parcels. In April to September last year, 320,000 people turned to a food bank for the first time. And as the Honourable Member for Oldham East mentioned, the Jacob Rowntree Foundation's Essential Guarantee, I do find it interesting that we're here debating how much the uprating to benefits is, but we never seem to actually debate what the correct amount is in the first place that can allow people to live with dignity with their essentials. And perhaps if people had that certainty, they would be better placed to improve their health and often their employment opportunities. And coincidentally, Madam Deputy Speaker, indeed I think I saw you there, the Trussell Trust is on the estate today, and I hope the Minister has had the time to visit them in the Churchill Room and hear directly from them. Indeed, the Minister and I worked together on the APPG for ending the need for food banks and our previous inquiry report into cash or food. But there today I learned my own statistics for North East Fife. I have one main Trussell Trust food bank in Cooper, which was up until recently ably run by Joe Priest, who has just stepped down after a number of years in charge. And those statistics showed me that there's been a 25% increase in the use of the Cooper Food Bank since 2018. Now, that's before COVID. There's lots of reasons given by the government about the fact that people are experiencing pressures due to the cost of living, but we all know in this place that food bank use was increasing long before COVID came along. Child poverty, Madam Deputy Speaker, costs the Government £39 billion each year through immediate additional public services and the delayed costs associated with the higher risk of unemployment in adults who grew up in poverty. £39 billion a year, a huge amount of, to some extent, avoidable spending. And I find it hard to believe that if you found a voter who thought that letting a child live in poverty was acceptable if we could avoid it. But even if you could find that voter, I'm pretty sure they would be horrified by the amount it is costing them, the taxpayer, to effectively do nothing. So I do put this to the Minister and the Government. I think the Government is shooting itself in the foot by uprating benefits with inflation whilst keeping the 2-child limit and freezing the benefit cap. And the Minister might say in his closing remarks that the cap was increased last year, but that is disingenuous considering it had been frozen since 2016 when it was actually lowered. Now, last year's uprating was vital but totally insufficient in ending poverty. Madam Deputy Speaker, when I was elected in December 2019, there were 41,000 families across the UK subject to the benefit cap. Now there are over 75,000. And the drop in numbers when they uprated in last April is going to quickly vanish if this cap is now frozen for another 7 years. Indeed, these are the two policies which, if changed, would be the most effective and efficient means of lifting hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. And I don't know how long the Minister is going to be in his current position. We don't know when the general election is going to come this year and what the change that might bring. But what a legacy that would be to take hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty. And I hope he agrees with me on that. Now, it wouldn't be a DWP debate from me without raising the issue of unpaid carers, and in particular carers' allowance. Following this uprating, carers' allowance will be £81.90 each week, claimable by the 1.3 million carers who do 35 hours of unpaid care each week. Full-time work, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is just £15.75 per week, more than when I was elected 4 years ago. For each hour of cooking, cleaning, bathing, appointments, admin and worrying, an extra 45 pence. So yes, I am bringing it up again. Now, I'm looking forward to meet the Chief Secretary to the Treasury next month to discuss carers' allowance, particularly in relation to the much-needed reforms of it, because I believe that carers' allowance actually creates barriers to work. But because almost half of carers receiving carers' allowance report that they are struggling to make ends meet, and if they are struggling, the people that they are caring for are struggling too. I'm going to end, Madam Deputy Speaker, with a local gripe. Yesterday I received a letter from the DWP North East of Scotland service leader. This followed on from the Department's written statement 6 days ago about starting the next phase of the transition to universal credit. Now, this letter, incidentally, was dated 7 days ago, and it told me that the move to universal credit expansion into North East Fife had been moved forward to 9 days ago. 2 days before the letter was written, 3 before the announcement was made by the Government, and over a week before I was actually told. Now, MPs rely on timely communications to be able to do our job, to scrutinise government activity and to support our constituents. I really hope that was a one-off error, but I'm raising it here in the hope that future errors can be prevented. Madam Deputy Speaker, these orders are a technical necessity, but when we look past that, when we look past the different ways of calculating inflation and the actuary arguments, what we are talking about is the kind of society we want to live in. During COVID, many found out for the first time about the inadequacies of our social security system, and for those remaining on it, it remains deeply inadequate.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can't better what the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth said about poverty in this country, and that we should reflect on if we're passing social security uprating orders, because the levels of poverty are an utter disgrace. One only has to spend a short time in a food bank in any part of this country to realise the desperation that many people have who are prepared to queue up, often for a very long period of time, to get a few packets of pasta in order to keep the family together for another week. And the numbers accessing food banks is going up all the time. Community centres are becoming more and more centres where people go to try and get food that's been donated by others, and that level of poverty is huge. There are two specific areas that affect these orders that I want to bring to the attention of the House. And the first one, the member for North East Fife just talked about, and that is the two-child benefit policy, where there is a limit on benefits beyond the first two children in universal credit. Like all members, I have many constituents who are part of very large families, quite large families. Somali community, Haredi Jewish community, Congolese community, Bengali community, a number of other communities often have quite large families. Is there anything morally right in saying that the third, fourth, fifth or sixth child in a family is less valuable than the first or second child in that family? Can anyone justify that in any way? I don't believe they can, yet this policy pertains. And the cost of changing the policy would be £1.3 billion. That might sound a lot, doesn't sound very much compared to overall government expenditure, doesn't sound very much compared to the benefits it would give to lifting a lot of children and families out of poverty. And there are at the moment around 1.3 million children who are affected by this, and they come from around 400,000 households. I thought the member was trying to give way. He was enjoying the speech. He was looking with interest on the speech, and I'm grateful to him for that and for what he said. So I just hope that as a result of this debate, the Minister will think seriously about examining the issues of poverty created by the two-child policy, and that all parties in this House will recognise that we ill-serve the community if we deliberately discriminate against children in large families. Those children living in poverty are less likely to achieve their best potential in school, less likely to achieve the jobs and careers they want. As a result, we all lose. We all lose on their talents because we disregarded their needs when they were at their most desperate. And I would hope that the Minister would at least be prepared to recognise that. The other area I just wanted to draw attention to is that of housing benefit. The uprating order obviously includes an increase in the housing benefit rate in line with the rate of inflation that's applicable to that benefit. The problem I find is that housing benefit in constituencies such as mine, where a third of the population live in the private rented sector, housing benefit is effectively never quite catching up with the level of increase in rents imposed by private sector landlords. It's not a London problem, it's in Glasgow, it's in Edinburgh, it's in Newcastle, it's all over the whole country. And the local housing allowance is increased, yes, in line with the perception of what the affordable rent level is within the community, but it never quite catches up. A friend I know was helping somebody to try and find a flat locally, and they spent days and days trawling through agents and all the other places one goes to try and find a flat, and they could find less than half a dozen rented flats available within the local housing allowance. And that means, and this applies to lots of inner urban areas, effectively, by not having either rent control or an efficient and sufficient level of housing benefit and a sufficient level of local housing allowance, it actually leads to expelling of the poorest communities from those communities. And so I just think we need to come back to this. We need to have private sector rent controls, and we need a local housing allowance that is realistic and does meet the housing costs of people. Otherwise, again, it's often the poorest and largest families that get shifted from one private rented sector flat to another, to another, to another, thus damaging their education, damaging their life chances altogether. If we are to live in a society where we're proud of our welfare state, the welfare state's got to work for the poorest in our community, and at the moment it frankly doesn't.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all those who have participated in the debate. I'm very disappointed in the member for Glasgow East because he seems to think that I don't write my own material. He really ought to know that my private office is sitting there now in trepidation because every speech I get off them, I write across it in blue ink and red ink, and they never know what's going to emerge from my mouth. So I can assure him it's all my own work, and he can criticise it all the more for that reason. I'm also a bit disappointed that people think this is just a technical necessity. I don't call £90 billion of government spending a technical necessity at all. I think it is one of the largest extra amounts of spending the government will engage in any one particular year. The difference it will make to individual lives up and down the country is considerable. So, now, the other lady asked whether I want a round of applause. No, I certainly don't. But I do want to think that we in this chamber don't really dismiss this as a technical measure at all. The member for Amber Valley made a point that I think he made this time last year, and that possibly I also, when I was sitting in the far corner there as a backbencher, also made around the timeliness of the application of these measures in an area when we ought to be able to doing it on perhaps a more prompt manner relative to when the inflation measure is taken. He will now be on the select committee. There's an issue that is often discussed and often revolves around the robustness of the IT system in UC compared to other legacy benefits. I am told, that, what I hope is promising news, that state pension benefits in particular will be moving to a more modern IT platform by 2025, followed by disability benefits, contributory benefits and carers allowance. So there is a pathway towards getting all our benefits on the IT systems modern enough to maybe be more agile in how they respond to economic situations. So I hear this point, and I think work is underway. I heard both the member for Glasgow East and the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth talking about the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I am a great admirer of the work they do. As a backbench MP, I sat on many a Zoom meeting or Teams meeting with them, listening to their briefings and understanding what they were talking about. The member for North East Fife knows that she and I have discussed on many a time the essentials guarantee. So I do take seriously what they say and take a personal interest. I think what I would say within that context, though, is that since the period covered by the report that they spoke about, the government has provided extra support to households to help with the high cost of living, worth over 104 billion. So whilst I understand that they will still stick to the broad themes of their arguments, I think we do need to recognise that government support has moved on since the point that their report refers to. On the member for North East Fife, I don't want to preempt her meeting with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, which I hope will bring better news than I might be able to deliver at a dispatch box. I also I heard about her letter. My favourite episode of 40 Towers is called Communication Difficulties. It's a comic classic, and I think possibly the tale that she tells is an example of that. So I'm sure the box have noted that, and we will hopefully follow up with it with a clarifying matter in that regard. And finally, the member for Islington North. Not being the Minister in charge of local housing allowance, I am a little cautious at giving him a more definitive answer at this stage. I will ensure he's written to. Well, nothing annoys me more when other ministers intrude on my brief without telling me, so it's a courtesy to other ministers, nothing more than that. So in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, draft social security operating order will increase the state pension by 8.5% in line with the growth in average earnings, will increase most other benefit rates by 6.7% in line with the rise in consumer prices. These changes commit the government to increase expenditure of 19 billion in 2024-25. They maintain the triple lock, protect pensioners on the lowest incomes, support those in the labour market whilst maintaining work incentives, and protect the value of benefits for those who cannot work and have additional disability needs. So I commend this instrument to the House.
Question is motion number 3 as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion number 4